My grandmother called me on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and I could tell from the first 2 seconds that something was wrong. "Sarah," she said, and her voice had that particular flatness to it. Not sad exactly, just emptied out. "Are you coming for Thanksgiving this year?" I was standing in the break room at the elementary school where I teach, still holding a stack of spelling tests I hadn't finished marking. "Of course, Grandma. I always come." She went quiet for a moment. "I just wasn't sure. Your mother mentioned the family might be going somewhere this year." I felt something shift in my stomach. Going somewhere? Going where? "Oh, I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe ask her." I called my mother that same evening. She picked up on the fourth ring, which meant she'd seen my name and debated answering. She always does that. "I heard you're planning something for Thanksgiving," I said, trying to keep my voice even. Yes." She didn't even try to ease into it. "Your father and I are taking your brother and his wife to Whistler for the long weekend. A ski trip. We've had it booked since August." "Since August," I repeated. "We figured you'd be fine. You always are." She said it like it was a compliment. Like being the one who handles things was a prize she'd awarded me. "Grandma is just in the house by herself. Someone should probably check in on her over the weekend. Maybe you could pop by." "Pop by." My grandmother lives 45 minutes from my apartment in Kitchener. She is 79 years old and has a bad hip she refuses to get properly looked at. "Pop by. You want me to check in on her while you take a ski trip," I said. "Sarah, please don't make this into something. You know how Grandma is. She doesn't really enjoy traveling anymore, and honestly, a long weekend in the mountains isn't her style. It made more sense for you to stay close." I didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. "We'll be back Sunday evening," she said. "You can come for dinner Monday." She hung up before I could answer. I sat with my phone face down on the kitchen table for a long time after that. My cat, a fat orange tabby I'd had since my 3rd year of university, jumped up and settled himself on top of the spelling tests. I let him. I've been the one who stays close my whole life. My brother is 2 years older than me, and my parents have always treated those 2 years like he was a different category of person. When he got into the business program at Laurier, my parents took him out to a nice dinner at a steakhouse downtown. When I got my teaching certificate, my mother said she was proud and then pivoted to asking if I'd thought about doing my master's so I could move into administration someday. As if the classroom wasn't the point. As if what I'd actually worked toward wasn't quite enough. My brother married a woman named Chelsea, who works in finance, and wears the kind of blazers that look like they cost more than my monthly grocery budget. My parents adore her. They talk about their portfolio at every family dinner like the rest of us are supposed to be keeping score. I teach grade 3. I make $68,000 a year, which in Ontario is a decent salary, and I'm proud of it. My parents have never once said they were proud of it. The closest my mother ever came was saying, "Well, at least you have summers off," which I have decided to interpret as generously as I can. The thing about my grandmother is that everyone in the family has always treated her the same way they treat me, like a box to be checked. My mother calls her every Sunday for exactly 11 minutes. I know it's 11 minutes because my grandmother once timed it and told me, laughing a little, not quite laughing. My brother visits at Christmas, and eats her cooking, and talks about himself for 2 hours, before remembering to ask how her hip has been. I visit every 3 weeks or so. I bring her those butter tarts from the bakery on King Street that she likes. We watch old episodes of Coronation Street together, and she tells me stories about growing up in rural Nova Scotia in the 1960s, about my grandfather who died when I was 4 and who I only know from photographs. She keeps one on the mantel above the fireplace, him in a dark suit, her in a cream dress, standing in front of a small white church somewhere near Antigonish. She looks so young in it. She always looks at it for a moment longer than she needs to when she's telling a story about him. I decided that night, sitting at my kitchen table with my cat on the spelling tests, that I wasn't going to pop by. I was going to spend the whole weekend. I packed a bag Thursday morning and drove out to her house in Elmira, the little white 2-story she's lived in for 40 years. With the rose bushes along the front that she cuts back herself every autumn, even though her hip makes her wince. I pulled into the driveway just after 11, and she was already at the door before I'd turned off the engine. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said. "I know," I said. "I wanted to." She looked at me for a second, like she was checking whether I meant it. Then she stepped back and let me in, and the house smelled the way it always does, like old wood and lavender sachets and something with cinnamon on the stove. She'd already started a pot of apple cider. We spent Thursday afternoon making tourtière from scratch, which was my grandfather's family's recipe from his Quebecois side, the only French thing that survived into an otherwise very maritime household. She let me roll the pastry while she handled the filling, and she was very particular about the spices. Exactly this much cloves, not a pinch more. Your grandfather always said a heavy hand with cloves means you're showing off. I laughed at that, and she laughed too, and it occurred to me that I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard her laugh that easily. Thursday evening, we ate at the kitchen table, just the two of us, and the tourtière and a salad she'd made, and she asked me about school. Not in the way my mother asks, which is really just checking a box. She asked about specific kids. She remembered that I'd mentioned a boy named Marcus in September, who was struggling with reading but loved drawing, and she asked how Marcus was doing. I had to stop and think about the last time anyone had remembered a name I'd mentioned in passing, and asked a follow-up question a month later. "He's doing better," I said. "We found some graphic novels at his level, and it clicked something. He's reading now. Actually reading." She put down her fork and looked at me. "That's a miracle, you know. What you do. It doesn't always feel like it. Most miracles don't, when you're the one doing the work." She picked her fork back up. "Your grandfather used to say that about farming. He said you never feel like you've done anything remarkable. You just show up every day and tend to things. And then one day there's something there that wasn't there before." I thought about that for a long time after dinner. Friday my mother called me. Not to check on her own mother, to ask me to remind Grandma that the property tax was due in December and that she should make sure to set aside enough in her checking account. That was the call. A reminder about property tax. I relayed the message, and my grandmother nodded and said, "Yes, I know. I've owned this house for 40 years. And then we went back to watching television, and I didn't mention my mother again for the rest of the weekend. Saturday it rained, that gray persistent November rain that makes the whole world feel like it's been turned down a notch. We played Scrabble. My grandmother is ferociously good at Scrabble, and beats me consistently, which I find genuinely humbling. She put down quixotic on a triple word score, and looked at me across the board with the most serene expression. "Where did you learn that word?" I asked. "I read, Sarah." That afternoon, between games, she turned down the volume on the little radio she keeps in the kitchen, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Considered. Like she'd been deciding whether to say something and had arrived at a decision. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Of course." She folded her hands on the table. "You know your grandfather built his business from nothing. Hardware supply. He started with a van, and a catalog and a handshake, and by the time he sold it, in 2001, he had 42 employees." She paused. "He sold it for $2.6 million. I didn't say anything. She'd never talked about numbers before, not specifically. "We bought this house in 1983. It was paid off by 1997. The money from the business, most of it went into a managed investment account. I've left it alone for 23 years. I have a good financial advisor in Guelph. His name is David, and he sends me a statement every quarter and calls me on my birthday." She smiled slightly. "I reinvested everything for 23 years, Sarah. I am not a woman who needs to be reminded about her property tax." I looked at her. She held my gaze. "I tell you this because I want you to understand that I see things clearly," she said. "I'm not old and confused. I know who visits and who calls for 11 minutes on Sundays. I know who sends their daughter to check on me while they go skiing in British Columbia." She said it without bitterness. Just plainly. The way she talked about cloves. "I've been making a decision for some time. I just wanted you to know that I see things clearly." She turned the radio back up. I didn't ask her what she meant. She'd said what she meant to say, and I understood we wouldn't be discussing it further, at least not then. I just sat with it, and we played another round of Scrabble, and she beat me again. I drove home Sunday evening with a container of leftover tourtière on the passenger seat, and something sitting in my chest that I couldn't quite name. My family came back from Whistler on Sunday night. My mother texted me, "Back safe. How was Grandma?" I typed fine. "She's well," and put my phone away. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late January, 14 weeks later. I was at school, in the middle of reading circle, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I have a rule about phones during reading circle, and I kept to it. It buzzed again, and then again. I had a student finish her paragraph, and then I asked the supply teacher from down the hall to step in, and I went into the corridor. It was David, the financial advisor from Guelph. He'd gotten my number from a document my grandmother had filed with his office. "I'm very sorry for your loss," he said. My grandmother had passed in her sleep on Sunday night. A neighbor had found her Monday morning when she didn't come out to get the newspaper. It was her heart, which apparently had been quietly failing for several months. She hadn't told anyone except her doctor. I sat down on the floor of the school corridor, with my back against the wall, and I didn't cry immediately. I just sat there. A student walked by and looked at me with wide eyes, and I managed to say I'm okay, which was not true but was the right thing to say to an 8-year-old. I cried in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I was able to drive. The funeral was small. My grandmother had asked for simple a service at the United Church in Elmira, where she'd attended for 40 years, and burial beside my grandfather. She had prearranged everything, down to the flowers. White carnations and sprigs of cedar. Very her. At the reception afterward, in the church hall, my mother made the rounds looking gracious and sorrowful in a way that people who didn't know her would have found touching. My brother gave a short speech about how Grandma had always made the best shortbread at Christmas. My father shook hands with people he didn't know, and talked about traffic on the 401. I stood near the table with the sandwiches and tea, and talked to the neighbors who had actually known her. A woman named Patricia, who had been her friend for 30 years. An older man from her church council named Gerald, who told me my grandmother had talked about me often, had said I was the one who really listened. I held on to that. I still hold on to it. 8 days after the funeral, a woman named Elaine called me. She was an estate lawyer with an office in Waterloo. My grandmother had retained her 3 years prior and had updated her will 14 months ago. She asked if I could come in on Thursday. I rearranged my prep period and came in. Elaine's office was on the 3rd floor of a building near Uptown Waterloo, very clean, plants on the windowsill. She offered me tea, and I took it. She had a file folder on the desk in front of her with my grandmother's name on the tab, and she opened it with the same care my grandmother had used when she took the tourtière recipe out of its box. My grandmother's estate, as of the most recent valuation, was $1.4 million in investment accounts, plus the family home in Elmira, which had been appraised at $680,000. I set down my tea. In the will, my grandmother had left my mother, my father, and my brother $15,000 each. A specific gift, Elaine explained, which is different from a residual gift. A specific dollar amount, named clearly. The remainder of the estate, the investments, the house, the contents of the house, and a separate savings account in the amount of $34,000 had been left to me. She also included a letter, Elaine said. She asked that you be given it privately. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on her good stationery, the cream-colored paper with the faint blue border that she kept in the second drawer of her writing desk. She had very neat handwriting, small and precise, that I had always admired. She wrote about my grandfather, about how he had built something from nothing because he believed that showing up every day and doing the work with your whole self was the only way to build anything worth having. She wrote that she had watched me teach, that she'd come to my school once, 2 years ago, without telling me, and stood at the window of my classroom for 20 minutes. I hadn't known. She wrote that she had watched me with my students the way my grandfather had worked his route in those first years, carefully and cheerfully, and that she recognized something in it. She wrote, "I know you didn't spend that Thanksgiving weekend with me because you expected anything. That's the only reason I'm giving you everything. She wrote. The rose bushes need to be cut back in early November. Don't let anyone tell you October is fine. It isn't. She wrote, I love you. Take care of the butter tart place on King Street. Tip well. I sat in Elaine's office for a while after I finished reading it. Elaine very kindly pretended to have things to organize in her filing cabinet. My mother called me that evening. I could tell from the first syllable that she'd already heard from her own lawyer. Sarah. Her voice was different. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. There hasn't, I said. Your grandmother clearly wasn't. Grandma's financial advisor will confirm she was in full possession of her faculties, I said. She updated her will 14 months ago. She planned this. There's no misunderstanding. A long silence. We're her children, she said. Your father is her son. I know. $15,000, Sarah. After everything. I waited for her to say what everything was, what they had done for her. I genuinely waited, holding the phone, because I wanted to hear it. She didn't say it. There was nothing to say. She knew what she wanted, I said finally. She was very clear about it. I've heard from my brother twice since then. Once, a long text that I read and did not respond to. Once, a voicemail that I listened to and deleted. My mother and I have not spoken in 4 months. My father sent a card at Easter that said Happy Easter, and I thought that was actually quite a respectful amount of restraint, and I sent one back. I listed the house in Elmira in the spring. The market was slow, but the house sold in 6 weeks to a young couple from Guelph with a baby and a dog, who stood in the driveway the day I handed over the keys and looked up at the rose bushes and asked about them. I told them to cut them back in early November. The wife pulled out her phone and typed a note. I've kept the investment accounts mostly as they were. David in Guelph, David, who calls on birthdays and sends quarterly statements, has been helpful and patient with my questions. I'm not drawing on it. I don't know exactly what I'll do with it yet. My grandmother sat on her husband's money for 23 years and made it grow, and I think there's something to learn from that kind of patience. I kept the photograph from the mantel. It's on my bookshelf now. My grandfather in his dark suit, my grandmother in her cream dress, in front of that white church in Antigonish. She's laughing at something just outside the frame. I don't know what it was. I don't need to know. It's enough that she was happy, and that someone was there to see it. I went back to school in September, and Marcus, my student who struggled with reading until we found the graphic novels, came running up to me on the first day, with a book tucked under his arm that he'd read over the summer. A chapter book, 220 pages. I finished it twice, he said. I thought about my grandmother watching through the window. About my grandfather on his route in those first years, showing up with a van and a catalog and a handshake. About what it means to tend to something every day until it's there, and it wasn't there before. Tell me everything, I said. And he did.